Delegate Stevens, a sharp, gravelly voice rasped from above. High Commander Thraxus loomed on a raised dais, his crimson-hued exoskeleton glinting under the artificial sunlight. What purpose does your species seek here? Humans have nothing to offer but their incessant pleas for recognition. Laughter rippled through the chamber, a cacophony of alien tones. Stevens kept his posture steady, though he felt the weight of their mockery pressed down on him. Earth seeks only to contribute to the shared prosperity and security of the Galactic Union, he began, his voice measured and firm. Humanity's history of resilience and innovation. History, interrupted Counselor Valor, his serpentine body coiled elegantly in his gilded seat. His eyes, glittering with malice, narrowed. Your history is a footnote at best. You stand here, a species barely out of its cradle, preaching to civilizations that have endured for millennia. Stevens' lips tightened into a thin line. A footnote, perhaps, but even footnotes can hold vital truths. The chamber erupted again, a mixture of derisive laughter and murmured disdain. Stevens allowed himself a breath to center his thoughts, recalling the advice of an old mentor. Never rise to their bait. Let your silence unsettle them. He remained still, his eyes scanning the room. The laughter gradually faded, leaving a strained silence. Delegate Stevens, Thraxus growled, leaning forward. Your words are hollow, and your presence here wastes our time. Humanity has no fleets to defend the Union, no technology to advance its cause. Why should we bother acknowledging you at all? Stevens' heart thudded once in his chest, but outwardly he remained unflinching. We may lack the resources of larger empires, he replied, his voice carrying a quiet intensity. But humanity has always thrived when underestimated. Dismiss us if you wish. It will not be the first time, nor will it be the last. Valor sneered, spoken like a species accustomed to irrelevance. The council chambers fell silent as the central figure overseeing the proceedings, an elder of the crystalline lumineth species, struck their staff against the ground. The resonant chime commanded attention. Enough, the elder intoned, their voice resonant with authority. Delegate Stevens has the right to speak, whether or not we find his claims credible. Stevens inclined his head in gratitude, though he could feel the animosity radiating from many of the gathered species. He resumed his presentation, outlining Earth's modest proposals for mutual defense agreements and trade pacts. Yet every word was met with thinly veiled derision or outright scorn. The tension in the room rose palpably when Stevens attempted to address the growing instability along the Union's borders. There are forces amassing beyond the outer rim, he said. Reports of attacks on isolated colonies. More rumors and conjecture. Thraxus interrupted with a dismissive wave of one clawed hand. Typical human fear-mongering. Stevens's jaw tightened, but he pushed forward. If the Union does not act, we risk. Risk nothing, Valor hissed. What you call a threat is likely your attempt to manufacture relevance. Earth seeks to scare us into granting them favor. The room erupted again, voices clashing in overlapping arguments. Stevens stood motionless, letting the storm rage around him. He knew better than to shout over them. Any display of frustration would only validate their perception of him as weak. Instead, he allowed the furor to burn itself out before speaking again, his tone sharp enough to cut through the noise. Dismiss my warnings if you will, he said, his voice carrying an edge of steel. But history has a habit of humbling those who are too blind to see the storm on the horizon. Thraxus's mandibles clicked, and Valor's lip curled, but neither interrupted him this time. Stevens took the opportunity to conclude his address, his words measured but deliberate. Humanity may be small in number, but we are not insignificant. And when the time comes, when the storm breaks, I hope you remember this moment. He stepped back from the podium, his posture straight and unyielding. The chamber erupted once more, but this time, the derision was mixed with a faint undercurrent of unease. Stevens caught the eye of the Lumineth elder, who regarded him with an inscrutable expression. Perhaps, he thought, not all had dismissed him outright. As Stevens exited the chamber, his thoughts churned with a mixture of frustration and determination. The council's arrogance was maddening, but he had planted a seed. Whether it would grow depended on forces beyond his immediate control. For now, he would bide his time, waiting for the storm to prove him right. The faint hum of the Galactic Council's towering space station echoed through the dim corridors as Alexander Stevens walked back to his quarters, his polished shoes clicking against the alloy floors. The tension from the council session still lingered in his chest, a weight he carried with practiced calm. He had known this mission would be a challenge, but the disdain he had faced exceeded even his most pessimistic expectations. The door to his quarters slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a sparsely furnished room that spoke to his practicality. A single desk, a chair, and a cot. Nothing more than the essentials. Stevens stepped inside, allowing the door to seal shut behind him, muffling the distant buzz of station activity. He tapped a panel on the wall, activating a security field that shimmered faintly around the room. "Secure channel," he said aloud. The air pulsed with a soft tone as the field stabilized. "Channel active," replied a smooth, artificial voice. Moments later, a holographic figure flickered to life in the center of the room. Admiral Thomas Henderson, his weathered face framed by a short crop of graying hair, gazed at Stevens with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "They didn't take you seriously, did they?" Henderson asked, his voice deep and steady. Stevens gave a bitter smirk. "They wouldn't be the Galactic Council if they did. Earth is still the run of the litter as far as they're concerned." He leaned against the edge of the desk, his hands gripping the surface. "Thraxus mocked us outright. Valor wasn't much better. They laughed when I brought up the attacks on the outer colonies." Henderson frowned. "That's not good. We've confirmed 3 more raids this week. Patterns match the Avarkai tactics. If the Council won't act—" "They won't," Stevens interrupted, his tone sharper than intended. He exhaled, forcing himself to soften. "They're too busy squabbling over territory and trade agreements. To them, humanity is just a nuisance, a species still earning its place at the table." "But you're not just humanity," Henderson said, his gaze steady. "You're you. If they knew who you really were, what you've done—" "They can't know," Stevens said firmly, straightening. "Not yet. The moment my past becomes public, the Council will use it as leverage to discredit Earth. We can't afford that right now." The silence hung between them, heavy with unspoken memories. "Have you reached out to the others?" Henderson finally asked. Stevens nodded. "Lock Squad is holding position near the outer rim. Their stealth ships are monitoring the trade routes for any signs of the enemy. If the Avarkai are truly back, we'll know soon enough." "And what about you?" Henderson's voice softened, his expression turning paternal. "How long can you keep playing this role?" "As long as I have to," Stevens replied, his voice resolute. "The Council sees me as a weak diplomat, someone to ignore. That's our advantage. They won't see the punch coming until it's too late." The hologram flickered briefly, and Henderson's image wavered. "We're with you, Alex. Just give the word when it's time." Stevens nodded again, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks, Thomas. I'll be in touch." The hologram vanished, leaving the room in silence once more. Stevens deactivated the security field and moved to the cot, sitting on its edge. He rolled up his sleeve, revealing a jagged scar that ran the length of his forearm, a reminder of battles fought and lives lost. For a moment, he allowed the memories to surface. The chaos of combat, the sharp tang of blood and burnt metal, the faces of those who had followed him into hell and never returned. A chime broke his reverie, signaling an incoming message. Stevens stood and approached the desk, activating the console. A grainy video feed filled the screen, showing Commander Jason Locke, his expression grim. "Stevens," Locke began without preamble, "we've got movement. A small convoy on the rim was hit 2 hours ago. Survivors are reporting advanced tech, cloaked ships, plasma-based weaponry. It matches the Avarkai profile perfectly." Stevens' jaw tightened. "Casualties?" 30 dead. Another 50 missing. The colony supply lines are crippled. Locke hesitated, his voice lowering. Alex, this isn't just a few raids. They're probing for weaknesses. If they keep this up, it won't be long before they strike something bigger. Stevens's mind raced, assessing the implications. The Avarkai were a shadow of the past, a name that had become a whispered warning among the galaxy's elders. Officially, they had been wiped out decades ago, their fleet shattered by an alliance of species that now sat complacent in the council chambers. But Stevens knew better. He had been there during the last days of the war, had seen the cunning and ruthlessness of the Avarkai firsthand. "We need proof," Stevens said, his tone sharp. "Something concrete to force the council's hand." "We're working on it," Locke replied. "But if they keep hitting isolated targets, it's going to be hard to pin them down. We need resources, reinforcements." "We'll have them," Stevens interrupted. "One way or another, I'll make the council listen." Locke gave a curt nod, and the feed cut off. Stevens stared at the blank screen for a long moment, his thoughts a storm of frustration and determination. The council's arrogance was blinding them to the danger at their doorstep. If they continued to ignore the threat, the galaxy would burn, and Earth would be caught in the flames. Stevens turned to the window, his reflection blending with the vast expanse of stars beyond. He had once thought he could leave the war behind, that diplomacy could be his redemption. But the universe had a way of pulling him back into the fray. The shadows of the past were stirring, and Stevens knew he would have to confront them once more. The silence of space was broken by the crackling of intercepted transmissions. Stevens sat in the shadowed confines of the surveillance room, his expression carved from stone as he listened. Fragmented reports from the rim played over the speakers, voices frantic, overlapping, some cutting out entirely. Words like attack, invisible ships, and total annihilation were repeated with chilling regularity. "Same patterns," said Commander Jason Locke, leaning over the console beside him. His sharp features were illuminated by the faint blue glow of the holographic display. "Precision strikes, hit-and-fade tactics. They're not raiding. They're clearing the way for something bigger." Stevens nodded, his gaze locked on the display. The map of the rim showed a growing cluster of red markers, each one representing a site of devastation. "They're testing our response times," he said, his voice low but steady. "Learning how fast we can react, how much resistance they'll face. It's classic Avarkai strategy. They're preparing for a full-scale assault." Locke grimaced. "If they move beyond the rim, the council won't have time to mobilize. You know as well as I do they'll sit there arguing while colonies burn." Stevens pushed back from the console and stood, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. "Then we can't wait for them. It's time to act." The room fell into a tense silence as Locke studied him. "You're ready to blow your cover?" "If I don't, there won't be anything left to protect," Stevens replied. He walked to the communications panel and keyed in a secure code. A moment later, Admiral Henderson's face flickered onto the screen. "Stevens," Henderson greeted, his tone heavy with expectation. "I take it this isn't a social call." "No," Stevens said firmly. "The Avarkai are mobilizing. We've confirmed their presence on the rim, and they're escalating. We need to intercept them before they strike deeper into Union space." Henderson frowned. "You realize what this means? If you reveal yourself, there's no going back. The council will demand answers." "Let them," Stevens said, his voice carrying a hard edge. "They've had their chance to act and they failed. It's time we showed them what humanity is capable of." Henderson studied him for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. "I'll mobilize a fleet." "Your orders." "Have Locke's squad link up with the Perseus and form a strike group. I'll take command from there. We'll engage the Avarkai head-on and give the council a reason to stop ignoring this threat." "Understood," Henderson said. "We'll be ready." The transmission ended, and Stevens turned back to Locke. "Rally your men. We leave in 2 hours." Locke gave a sharp salute and strode from the room, his steps echoing through the corridor. Stevens remained behind, staring at the map as if willing it to reveal the enemy's next move. His hands rested on the edge of the console, the scar on his forearm catching the light. For years, he had lived in the shadows, hiding his past behind a mask of diplomacy. But now, the war hero within him was stirring once more, called back to the forefront by the threat looming on the horizon. 2 hours later, the Perseus, a sleek warship bristling with advanced weaponry, slipped silently from its docking station. Stevens stood on the bridge, his presence commanding as he watched the stars blur into streaks of light. Around him, the crew moved with practiced efficiency, their respect for him evident in every glance. Locke joined him, his expression resolute. "Fleet's in position. The Eclipse and the Vanguard are flanking us, and we've got 2 more stealth frigates running recon ahead." "Good," Stevens said, his voice steady. "What's the latest from the Rim?" "Another colony hit," Locke said grimly. "No survivors this time. But we managed to track their exit vector. They're heading toward the Arctos sector." Stevens's jaw tightened. The Arctos sector was home to a critical trade hub, a lifeline for countless colonies. If the Avarkai struck there, the devastation would ripple across the galaxy. "Set course for Arctos," he ordered. "We intercept them before they reach the hub." The bridge hummed with activity as the crew carried out his orders. Stevens stared out the viewport, his mind racing. The Avarkai were ruthless, their technology far superior to most of the galaxy's forces. But they had a weakness, a rigidity in their tactics that Stevens had exploited once before. As the fleet approached the Arctos sector, the tension on the bridge grew palpable. The recon ships reported back, confirming the presence of the Avarkai fleet. A dozen massive warships, their sleek, black hulls shimmering with cloaking technology. Stevens studied the tactical display, his mind already formulating a plan. "They'll expect us to engage head-on," he said. "We won't give them the satisfaction. Send the frigates to flank their position and disrupt their formation. The Perseus will draw their fire, while the Eclipse and Vanguard hit them from the rear." Locke grinned. Classic Stevens strategy. Make them think they're winning until it's too late. Stevens allowed himself a faint smile. It worked before. Let's hope it works again. The battle began with a burst of light and sound as the Avarkai fleet opened fire. The Perseus shuddered under the impact of plasma blasts, but Stevens remained calm, barking orders with precision. The flanking frigates launched a barrage of missiles, forcing the enemy to split their focus. The bridge was a controlled chaos of alarms and shouted commands as Stevens orchestrated the attack. His mind was a whirlwind of calculations, anticipating the enemy's moves before they made them. "Target their command ship," he ordered. "Without it, they'll lose coordination." The Eclipse delivered the decisive blow, its railgun piercing the command ship's shields and tearing through its hull. The Avarkai fleet faltered, their formation collapsing under the onslaught. As the last of the enemy's ships retreated, the bridge erupted in cheers. Stevens allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction before turning to Locke. "Send a report to the Council. Let them know what we faced here, and what would have happened if we hadn't acted." Locke nodded, his grin wide. "Message will be loud and clear." Stevens returned his gaze to the viewport, the stars once again calm and steady. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. The Avarkai had been pushed back, but they were far from defeated. Stevens knew they would strike again, and next time, the Council would have no choice but to listen. The aftermath of the battle hung in the air like smoke, invisible but suffocating. Stevens stood on the bridge of the Perseus, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the debris field that had once been an Avarkai fleet. The stars seemed colder now, their light dimmed by the violence that had unfolded here. Victory had come, but it carried the weight of an unspoken truth. This was only the beginning. The comms panel chimed, breaking the somber quiet. Locke stepped forward to answer, his expression hardening as the holographic form of Admiral Henderson flickered to life. "Admiral," Stevens greeted, his tone measured but carrying a hint of fatigue. Henderson's sharp gaze swept over the bridge, taking in the battered but operational state of the crew. Reports are already flooding in from the Council. They're calling it reckless, an unauthorized engagement that jeopardized diplomatic stability. Stevens's lips curled into a wry smile. And yet, they're alive to complain about it because of that engagement. Henderson's expression softened slightly. That's not all. Word of your actions is spreading beyond the council chambers. Colonies on the rim are hailing you as a hero. Even some of the more stubborn council members are beginning to reconsider their stance. Fear is a powerful motivator, Stevens replied. He turned to Locke, nodding for him to relay a message to the fleet. They needed a demonstration, something tangible to wake them from their complacency. Now they have it. Henderson leaned closer, his voice lowering. But it won't last. The Avarkai will retaliate, and when they do, the Council may still hesitate. We need more than a single victory, Alex. We need unity. Stevens's jaw tightened. Unity. The one thing that had eluded the galaxy for centuries, and the one thing it needed most to survive the coming storm. Then we make them see, he said, his voice steady. We use this momentum to rally the colonies, the outliers, anyone willing to stand together. The Council can either join us or be left behind. Henderson nodded, though his expression remained grave. You'll have my full support. But you're walking a fine line, Alex. If you push too hard. I know the risks, Stevens interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. But I also know what's at stake. The transmission ended, and Stevens turned to the crew. Their faces were a mixture of exhaustion and resolve, their loyalty to him unshaken despite the odds they faced. We've bought ourselves time, he said, his voice carrying across the bridge. But the Avarkai won't stop. They'll regroup, they'll adapt, and they'll come back stronger. We need to be ready. The crew responded with a unified murmur of agreement. Locke stepped closer, his expression unreadable. So, what's next? Stevens's gaze shifted to the tactical display, where the remnants of the Avarkai fleet were marked in retreat. We take the fight to them, he said. No more waiting, no more reacting. We find their base of operations, their command structure, and we dismantle it piece by piece. Locke's grin returned, sharp and eager. Sounds like a plan. As the fleet prepared for its next move, Stevens retreated to his quarters. The small, sterile room offered little comfort, but it was a sanctuary of sorts, a place where he could think without the weight of command pressing down on him. He sank into the chair by the desk, his mind racing through strategies and contingencies. A soft chime signaled a message on his private console. He activated the screen, and the image of the Lumineth Elder from the council chamber appeared. Their crystalline form shimmered faintly, their expression unreadable as always. Delegate Stevens, they began, their voices calm and measured as ever. The council is in disarray. Many question your methods, but others cannot ignore the results you have achieved. The tides are shifting. Stevens leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Shifting isn't enough. The council needs to act. The Avarkai won't wait for them to finish their debates. The elder inclined their head slightly. You are not wrong, but you must tread carefully. The council's unity is fragile, and a divided union will serve no one. Unity requires leadership, Stevens countered. And right now, no one else is willing to step up. If the council won't take responsibility, then I will. The elder's gaze held his for a long moment before they spoke again. You carry the burden of your species, Delegate Stevens. Do not let it crush you. The transmission ended, leaving Stevens alone with his thoughts. He leaned back in his chair, his hand brushing the scar on his forearm. The weight of his decisions pressed down on him, but he pushed it aside. There was no room for doubt. Not now. Hours later, the fleet dropped out of hyperspace near an isolated star system on the edge of known space. Intelligence reports had traced the Avarkai fleet to this region, and Stevens knew they would not find an easy victory here. The fleet moved into formation, the larger ships flanked by smaller, nimbler vessels. Stevens stood on the bridge of the Perseus, his gaze locked on the holographic display as it filled with enemy signatures. "Enemy fleet detected," Locke reported, his voice steady despite the tension. "It's bigger than we anticipated." Stevens's expression hardened. "Size isn't everything. They're expecting fear. Let's give them fire instead." The battle erupted with blinding flashes of light and the deafening roar of weapons fire. Stevens moved through the chaos like a conductor leading an orchestra, his commands precise and unwavering. The fleet fought with a cohesion that belied their smaller numbers, exploiting every weakness in the Avarkai's formation. As the battle raged, Stevens's focus sharpened. The enemy flagship loomed on the display, its dark hull bristling with weaponry. It was the heart of their operation, and Stevens knew it had to fall. "Target the flagship," he ordered. "All ships, concentrate fire." The fleet responded as one, their combined firepower slamming into the flagship's shields. The Avarkai retaliated with brutal efficiency, but the Union fleet held firm, their determination unshaken. Finally, with a deafening explosion, the enemy flagship broke apart, its pieces scattering into the void. The remaining Avarkai ships faltered, their formation collapsing as they scrambled to retreat. Cheers erupted on the bridge, but Stevens remained silent, his gaze fixed on the debris field. Victory had come at a cost, and he would not forget the lives lost to achieve it. Locke approached him, his grin tempered by exhaustion. "We did it," he said. Stevens nodded slowly. "We won this battle, but the war is far from over." As the fleet regrouped and began the journey back to Union space, Stevens allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The galaxy was changing, its fragile alliances tested by the fires of war. Redemption was a fleeting thing, earned only through constant struggle. But for the first time in years, Stevens felt a spark of hope. Humanity had proven its worth, not through words but through action. And as long as he drew breath, he would fight to ensure the galaxy remembered that. As the fleet moved through the calm of hyperspace, Stevens remained on the bridge, staring out at the endless expanse of stars. The crew worked quietly around him, their exhaustion tempered by pride. For many, this victory was a turning point, a moment when humanity had risen above its reputation to prove its strength, courage, and resolve. Locke stepped up beside him, his voice breaking the silence. "You've set something in motion, Stevens. The Council will have no choice but to acknowledge what we've done here." Stevens nodded, his gaze distant. "Acknowledgement isn't enough. They need to act. This isn't about proving ourselves anymore. It's about survival. The Avarkai won't stop, and the next battle will demand more than we've given so far." Locke studied him for a moment before speaking, his tone softer. "You don't have to carry all of this alone, you know. The crew, the fleet, we follow you not because we have to, but because we believe in you." Stevens glanced at him, a faint smile touching his lips. Belief is a powerful thing. Let's hope it's enough. As the stars outside the viewport began to blur with the approach of their destination, Stevens felt the weight of the coming days settle over him. The battle against the Avarkai was far from over, and the Council's reluctance still loomed like a shadow over their efforts. But for the first time, there was a glimmer of something stronger than fear or doubt. Across the galaxy, colonies and fleets alike were beginning to look toward Stevens, not as a diplomat or an outsider, but as a leader, a war hero whose actions had united them in the face of an unimaginable threat. And he would not let them down.